What if Game Pass fails? You ever think about that one? Game Pass, the thing that Microsoft quite literally tells us to judge them by every time they report earnings, which, by the way, will be in about 2.5, 3 weeks here in the month of January. You ever think about what would happen if it failed? This question comes from a listener just like you, Chris Haney, I believe, who commented. He says, hey, I would definitely love to know, what would happen if Game Pass fails? Because at the end of the day, it is the hallmark of the Xbox brand right now. It is what Microsoft wants you to do. And I guarantee there is a contingency plan somewhere if things didn't materialize in the way that they wanted it to. Now, at this point in the sort of life cycle of Game Pass, I don't think that it's going to quote unquote fail. However, there are things that genuinely could happen and really change the dynamic of how Xbox basically lives inside the Xbox org or realistically gets moved outside. So this is, let's dive into the numbers and the details and talk about through what Microsoft could potentially do here. And it's not unprecedented what we're about to talk about because that has happened in the past. Let's go. So for right now, just to try to set the table, if you will, Game Pass has 34 million Game Pass subscribers. Now, that is a number that is dated. It's almost a year old at this point. However, we're just going to use this for some rough ballpark numbers just to help people understand how much Game Pass is actually probably making right now at a minimum, because unfortunately, Microsoft doesn't make this easy. Now, there's multiple tiers of Game Pass, right? It starts at $9.99 for Game Pass Core, or what we used to know as Xbox Live, and it goes all the way up to $20 dues a month. We will take a figure of just $14.99 right in the middle and multiply it by 34 million paying customers, and that gives you about $500 million per month. So that is a non-insignificant sum of money, right? $500 million a month. A lot of people will be very happy to have any business on planet Earth be making that kind of cheddar. Now, we know the number is hopefully higher at this point, right? It's been almost a year. Call of Duty has gone into Game Pass. Other big branded titles, Indiana Jones just launched. So if it was at 40 million, by the way, that would be $600 million per month. So it really, really does add up here. And I'm just trying to highlight some numbers before we get into the possibilities of it moving on in its own direction. So Phil Spencer has also previously said Game Pass is very, very sustainable right now as it sits. Now, this is a very loaded statement because sustainable, what does that even mean? Does it mean sustainable as in you could break it out into its own company and it would be able to pay its own bills? We don't really know. The one thing that we absolutely do know is that Xbox gets a little bit of a benefit, if you will, for being inside the greater Xbox org. And so what do I mean by that benefit? I mean, hey, I suspect they're probably getting a pretty good deal on that cloud infrastructure, right? So they don't have the typical bills, and I'm sure there's some intercompany billing that is a thing that happens on the balance sheet and the P&L for each org. It moves around, right? They have to pay for Azure use, but at the end of the day, it's really just paper money moving around, not actual greenbacks. But anyways, it is sustainable, but that's not super clear. Is it sustainable while still building console hardware or including console hardware? So I'm not trying to discredit what Phil said, but it's just a very nebulous, and it doesn't give us any real details that are going to make things better for it. I should say clarify exactly the financial standing of it. So let's dive in here. Xbox itself was actually a child that was told to leave the company by investors. You might remember this from when Satya Nadella took over Microsoft. A lot of investors were saying, hey, Microsoft should get rid of Xbox. It does not fit in the overall org. Bing was also in this conversation, by the way, and so was Windows Phone, and we know what happened to Windows Phone. And so Xbox, there was external pressure at one point to say, hey, get rid of this stuff, because it just doesn't align with the core, right? Microsoft wants to be a subscription company, and at that time, Xbox didn't really have subscriptions beyond Live, and Live wasn't a big enough revenue pool, and so they had to evolve, which is where Game Pass comes into the conversation. However, spinning things out of this magnitude is not unprecedented for Microsoft. For people who don't know their Microsoft history, this has happened before. Expedia, which I'm sure most people, at least in the United States, have heard of, was actually a Microsoft company. Back in '99, it was legitimately spun out of Microsoft into its own company, and it exists today. So saying that this hasn't ever happened where they could take Xbox at the end of the day and just say, look, it doesn't fit. Game Pass is not doing what we need to do. So option one, and probably what I would probably say is the most likely option rather than shutting down Game Pass, is actually to just spin it out into its own company. Because there's a lot of value locked up inside of Xbox that Microsoft, if they feel they can't get it through subscriptions, by spinning it out, they might be able to recapture some of that investment. And let's be real, it has been a lot. It's been $80 billion plus in the past few years. And so there's a lot riding on that. However, what if Game Pass truly does fail and Microsoft is like, we're going to shut it down? What would actually happen here? So it's interesting because what Microsoft in theory could do, right? I don't think we would just see like it's January 9th and Microsoft's like, we're shutting down Game Pass. I think it's important to understand that there would be precursors to Game Pass shutting down. Like, what would it look like? Well, first off, I think we'd start to see fewer day one perks, right? This is the first year that Microsoft launched Call of Duty, and I guarantee you right now, at least after the new year at some point, they're doing the math of like, okay, how many Game Pass subscribers did we get signed up versus how many typical sales would they see? Like, don't get me wrong, Microsoft has the data on you specifically if you bought Call of Duty previously and then you signed up for Game Pass and didn't buy it. So they have a ton of data to truly understand. Now, this only impacts Xbox for the most part, well, PC as well, but definitely not PlayStation. The loss of sales by having Game Pass. Now, granted, more than likely you'll keep paying for Game Pass, so they will recover. So it gets complicated. However, they can drill it down effectively into a very specific number. And what Microsoft could eventually determine is like, hey, Game Pass is really only propped up by like a few games like Call of Duty and maybe these day one titles that pop in and out. So I think if Microsoft were ever like seriously considering like shutting down Game Pass, before they would do that, we'd see an eroding of benefits, meaning fewer day one launches, right? Things like that. They would stop paying for third-party companies to do day one launches and that sort of thing. They would probably already increase the price. We've seen that once. It will not surprise me if we see that again. Keep that in mind. But price increases doesn't necessarily mean they're going to shut it down. It's just, we all know why companies do price increases. The other things we will continue to see too, right? Remember how you can jump between tiers? Starfield was a good example where you could pay like $29 to get a higher tier and get earlier access. We might see those benefits continue. Like, what if it was 49? Like, what is the magic number? What is 59 to get people to move tiers? So the initial thing we would see is an eroding of benefits at the end of the day before it shuts down. But let's say they're going to shut it down. Like, Game Pass is taking too much money from those Call of Duty sales and it just wrecked everything and people are churning like crazy, and Microsoft determined it's not sustainable. They don't want to spin it off, but they want to shut down Game Pass. Here's what I think they would actually do. I think they would come out with some sort of scenario where they just give you a number of back catalog games to, as like a make good for people who have been subscribing. Because you got to remember, there's a lot of people like myself who just continues to pay to have access to all these titles, and then if you shut it down, it's like I'm out, up the creek without a paddle, or up the creek without a game in this scenario. So you could see them giving you like an old back catalog Call of Duty title or something like that and saying like, look, going forward, we're not putting any more titles into Game Pass, and it's frozen in time, continue to pay or bail out or do whatever it is. I suspect that would be the route that they would go, in conjunction with raising the price for Xbox Live Gold/Core. Remember, they had this previous to Game Pass. They're definitely not going to get rid of it. So I suspect that they would change the Xbox Live online gaming functionality price from $9.99 to $14.99. I suspect is what they would do. So they would do some sort of make good, right? Because they're going to take a lot of pain in the PR world for doing this, and so they got to give the users something, and then they go back to that model. I don't know, but I suspect that actually shutting down Game Pass is probably not going to be happening ever. I think a spin out of Xbox is far more likely than anything else, because if Xbox, again, it's really important to understand, is like Xbox truly profitable if you back out all of the perks and benefits it gets from the bigger org providing things like Azure, providing things like IT support, HR, and all that stuff. There's a ton of overhead. Is Xbox truly profitable? We don't really know. We know hardware sales are typically break even in a best case scenario over the life cycle of a product. So there's a lot of things going on there. So anyways, this is a super interesting topic. I really appreciate Chris just bringing this up, because it's something I guarantee Microsoft has thought through and has tried to figure out what is our path if this doesn't work out. I think at this point, with $500 million which is probably a little bit conservative based off the 34 million number. Probably a little conservative because like I bet there's a decent number of people in the $20 tier, but I'm not accounting for. That's a lot of money to just say like, this isn't sustainable anymore. So, there's like the hypothetical of what would happen if Game Pass failed. I think I've said it multiple times, but spinning out is far more likely, I think, at this point than shutting down. Because if you spin out Xbox with a subscription service, that instantly gives them a lifeline of sustainable reoccurring revenue and gets them off the treadmill, if you will, of trying to ship to stay alive sort of mentality. So interesting thought piece, really, really interesting thought piece. Microsoft has dumped $80 billion plus into Game Pass and Xbox in the past few years. I suspect that they are not backing away, and that was more likely them doubling down after seeing some modest success, potentially with like Bethesda early on. So there you go. I love these ideas from the audience. I very much appreciate Chris for suggesting this. If you have any ideas for future videos, make sure to drop them in the comment. And as always, make sure to keep it subscribed here because the only BS on this channel is me.